Stanislav received his bachelor in philosophy at the Metropolitan State University of Denver and is now pursuing a master in modern and contemporary European philosophy at the University of Luxembourg. He currently is focused on understanding the subjective experience of pain and suffering in animals. In his presentation, Stanislav will talk about how many people remain skeptical that animals have the same capacity to feel pain and suffer as humans, and will elaborate why there is little to no reason for this skepticism. He will explain why, taking this information into account, the burden of proof is on the skeptic to justify how it could be that animals don't feel pain or suffer. Please welcome Stanislav Akopyan.
Okay, thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you for having me here today. And the first thing you may notice is that I changed the title of my presentation. And I'm still going to fulfill the promises I hope that were just outlined, but I changed the title of my presentation to starting to understand the subjective experience of pain and suffering in animals. And basically the reason for that is because as I was preparing this presentation, I realized that there's just way too much to cover in 30 minutes, and I would rather just focus on some extremely important basics. So I'm going to focus on two central topics, and one of those is consciousness or subjective experience, and the other one is the experience of pain and suffering. So here's the plan. First, I'm going to talk about my motivation for this, why I think this is important, and why I think we should all see this as being important. Then I'm going to talk about what I mean by subjective experience or consciousness. And there we're going to run into this other minds problem that we'll go over. And then after that, we're going to talk about a distinction between animals, which in this context, that's going to include humans and other biological organisms. And there we're going to bring in a theory of consciousness. And then lastly, we're going to talk about pain and pleasure. And I'm going to present those as essential aspects of animal consciousness. So essentially, the argument is going to be that wherever there is animal consciousness, there's necessarily pain and pleasure in some basic form. Okay. So why am I doing this? Well, essentially, like most of you throughout my life, I started wondering how I should treat animals. And the thing that I kept coming back to is what is happening inside of the animal? What is this animal experiencing? And are the experiences of pleasure and pain or pain and suffering part of this animal's experience? So first of all, I want to mention that this is pretty widely regarded as the condition for moral standing. It's the condition that gives something moral standing, some being, some entity. So it's very important that we get this right. Essentially, that is my point. So that's one of the reasons, is that this is extremely important for the type of views that we have about animals. We need to understand better what it's like to be an animal, and more specifically, what it's like with respect to the experiences of pain and pleasure, or suffering and pleasure. And also, people really seem to have opposing intuitions about this question. So most people will agree that cats and dogs and farm animals, for example, are sentient or aware or conscious, and that they have the capacity to feel pain and suffering. But then when it gets to fish or insects or jellyfish or plants, perhaps, it gets extremely controversial. And one place where it's still pretty controversial, I would say, is fish, and also insects. And I think, just generally speaking, if you ask people what they think, I've been talking to people about this just to try to get an idea of what people's intuitions are about this. And I would say, even let's say fish are for most people seem to be included, not for everybody, but as far as insects go and flies and really small animals that are small in size don't seem to get a lot of attention for some reason. So anyways, those are all good reasons to investigate this topic. And so one of the questions we're going to ask is, where do we draw a line? Or in what sense that question makes sense? Okay, so this is just a pretty little tree of life to give us, some representation of the types of creatures out there, or the types of organisms out there that we could attribute conscious experiences to, which include pain and suffering. So, at the top, you have, again, the animals that I think nobody would really argue with you about. But then as you start to get down this tree of life and you get to the insects, or especially to some of these worms or sponge, then it gets really tricky to try to understand what's happening inside of this animal. And again, this is important because this isn't my conclusion, but if it were true that what's going on inside of the worm is something extremely similar to what's going on inside of me, then that would be very important information to have when we're considering how to act with the worm. But again, that's not my conclusion, just an example of why this is important. So just really quickly, what I'm talking about when I say subjective experience, I'm talking about the same thing that people talk about when they use the word consciousness or experience or sentience. Essentially, it's what it's like from the subject's point of view to be that thing. So my subjective experience is what it's like for me to be me. And the subjective experience of some particular animal is what it's like for that animal to be that animal. So there are there's two ways of going about this. Some people like to attribute a property of consciousness to all matter. They say that consciousness is an inherent property of matter, that it doesn't emerge, but it's already there. And I just want to say that even if that's true, and maybe there's good reason for that to be true, I'm not sure, but even if that's true, that doesn't explain what it's like to be a living organism. And it surely doesn't explain anything about pleasure and pain. Even if it's true that this table is conscious in some very, very basic sense, or just in any sense at all, it doesn't change the fact that there's nothing about this table that I don't need to take the table's subjectivity into account if it is a subject, if it is conscious, for example. And the reason for that essentially is because there's something special about biological organisms, something special that starts with biological organisms, and that thing is that biological organisms seem to have interests, at least animals. So that's where it may be a little bit difficult to draw the line, is this line between biological organisms with interests like animals have interests, and we'll talk about that a little bit more, versus organisms that are more or less perhaps just kind of floating around. Okay, so the other way is to think that consciousness has evolved somewhere in our evolutionary history. So if we're looking at biology, we're either gonna, there are two options if we're gonna look at the biology of an organism, and that is to assume that, well, maybe consciousness doesn't start at the table, or maybe it's not inherent in all matter, but it starts at biological organisms. Or the other option is to say, no, it starts somewhere within this, somewhere in biological organisms. So there's a line somewhere between a single-celled organism, perhaps, in us, the lights come on, and all of a sudden there's subjective experience. So that's what we're interested in. So our starting point is going to be biological organisms, and we're going to go from there. And so there's a problem that I'm going to mention just briefly, and that problem is that we really can't know for certain what it's like to be anything except for us. So this is referred to this is referred to as the other minds problem. And essentially the problem is that experience is private. So there's no way for me to have a direct understanding of what it's like to be any of you. Even though you're right here in my experience, I have no way to know what it's like to be you. And even if we imagine that one day we're going to be able to scan our brains and to present some sort of visualization and even connect sensors to us and really see and feel what other people are seeing and feeling, we would still be doing that necessarily through ourselves. So there's just no possible way to know exactly what it's like to be another being. So the best we can do is to have some knowledge by inference through our own experience. And so it's important to acknowledge that, but then still to see that there's plenty of work that can still be done, and we can still look to see what the best evidence is out there that there's a being out there that is similar to me in the sense that it has subjective experiences and it has the capacity to feel pain and suffering. So we're going to start with us, but then we're also going to look at some characteristics that we generally take other biological organisms to have. So this is a book by Christine Korsgaard, and essentially this is my starting point and the main work that I'm considering here. So again, this is what I'm writing about for my master thesis. So I wanted to have something that was a beginning to end. So in this book, Korsgaard starts with the basics, just like we're doing here. And then from that, she develops an ethics, or she brings in an ethics with this work that she's doing. And just so you know, she takes animals to be ends in themselves, which means that they matter for their own sake and that we shouldn't use animals for our own means. And then as far as where she starts the work that we're talking about here, she starts with this idea that's actually Aristotle's idea that it's possible to see living and also non-living, it's not non-living organisms, but non-living things. So living organisms and non-living things as serving a function, as having a function. So this table could be set to serve the function of holding things that we put on the table. But what's the function of a living organism? And the most basic function that we can think of with a living organism is self-maintenance, essentially. It's self-preservation. So everything that the organism is doing seems to be part of this kind of very basic function that it has. This includes a single-celled organism and also us. Okay, so as far as living organisms versus other objects go, living organism is an object which functions by maintaining its own well-functioning. So it's taking care of itself in some way. It has this self-referential character, and it's tending to its own well-functioning. And then, so next the question is, where do we draw a line between, is there a line to draw between living organisms, such as plants, for example, versus animals like us? And so this is Korsgaard's answer to this. And I think it's a pretty good one. And I'm going to try to explain why. And Korsgaard says that the difference between animals and other living organisms is that an animal is an organism that has valence, and that's another way of saying evaluative representations, which it uses to move towards things which are good for it and away from things that are bad for it. So what that means is that, so if you look at your own experience, for example, you have a representation of the world, you have a representation of the environment, And then you make evaluations with your representations. And if you can try to think of what the most basic purpose of an awareness of the world would be for a living organism, then the most basic purpose would be to, one, have some awareness of the world. But if you're a biological organism and you're also tending to your own well-functioning, then we assume that this is another way to talk about this is you can say that that's the organism's function, or you can say that it's the organism's interest. The organism is interested in its own well-functioning. And how is it going to do this? How is it going to make its way through its environment? Well, one, it has to be aware of its environment, and two, it has to be able to evaluate things in its environment as things that are good for it or things that are bad for it. Positive and negative evaluations, things to go towards, things to get away from. So I think that that is essential for whatever an animal, wherever we draw the line for animals. I think that that's as good of a definition we're going to start with, at least for now. I think this is the best starting point, because if I think of any animal and if I think of why an animal would matter to me, so why does a dog matter to me? Well, because it has its own interests, and I shouldn't just use it as a means to my own end, right? So the animal is self-interested, or it's interested in its own well-functioning and its own well-being. So I hope that makes sense. That's the core of this distinction between animals and other organisms. So one way to think about this is, where do we find consciousness in life? And it's with these valence representations, or these evaluative representations. And so if we use this idea, then an animal, by definition, is a conscious organism with its own interests. And here I'm echoing Korsgaard, but I agree with her on this. Okay, so far what we have essentially is that we have locomotion guided by valence representations. So these valence representations, again, they're positive, negative. Another way to potentially think about that is that they can be pleasant or painful. And this is essentially what this is going to lead to, is that if you think about what happens, or what happens when you make positive or negative evaluations, or better yet, think about the experiences of pain and pleasure. So what I would say is that implicit or inherent in those experiences are positive evaluations and negative evaluations. So whenever I'm in pain, and this can be physical pain or some sort of mental suffering, whether it's fear or depression or something like this, that very experience itself is an experience of negative evaluation, where whatever is happening to me, I'm thinking this is not good, this is bad, right? I'm rejecting this experience. And the opposite is true for pleasant experiences. Pleasant experiences are positive evaluations. I think this is a pretty basic idea, and it's fairly intuitive to say that the way that an organism can use pleasure and pain is that when something is bad for it, it hurts it, and when something is good for it, it's pleasant. Now, if we come to where we are now as humans, and you can think of examples like, well, maybe not everything that's pleasant is good for you. I think that there are good reasons that that's where we're at now, because the environment that we're in now is so extremely different from the environment that we evolved in. But if you think of things like why food tastes good, or why sweet things taste good, because these things are good for us, and so they're pleasant. Or why sex feels good, right? It's very important for an organism. And the same goes with feelings of pain. Something is painful because it's signaling to us that this is bad. And so the argument here is that it's not simply that pain and pleasure are signaling these things, is that they're signaling things that are good for us and bad for us. They are doing that, but the experiences themselves are positive are these evaluations. And I think that that's the best way to think about these experiences. Okay, so also, an organism is self-conscious if it's functionally unified over time. So what that means is that the way that an organism works is that it can have many different parts, but these different parts are unified towards one particular function. So that's something very special about an organism, that it has this ability, which is really intriguing, to take multiple for multiple parts to be unified towards one thing. And Korsgaard essentially says is that this functional unification over time is what conscious experience came out of. And she says that you're functionally unified insofar as you have an integrated point of view over time that allows you to carry out your projects. And again, I think this is just a very intuitive way of looking at things. And the more functionally unified an animal is over time, the more that experience accumulates, and the richer its life experiences, and the more it's like a self. So essentially, this is saying that consciousness and selfhood, at least the way that she's talking about selfhood, these things come in degrees. And the degree to which you're conscious is the degree to which you're unified over time. The functionally part comes in, and I think it's special to look at basic organisms in this way. You may not see your life as being functionally unified over time, but I think there's very good reason to think that even our lives work in this manner. And even if they don't, I think we're extremely special cases for reasons that I can't really get into, but it has to do with a capacity for us to see the grounds of our actions and to do something about them. And this is something that I think most animals lack, but yeah. Okay, so the next question is then, if this movement around this environment so if it's making evaluations of its environment and it's moving towards or away from those things, is that kind of the key? Is it movement? Is that where we draw a line? And so this is a very difficult question, because it's tough to know exactly whether there are things like active movements or passive movements. What constitutes a movement? Is a plant moving when it's growing? We're going to watch a really short video here soon where you see that when the video is sped up, it's very obvious that at a different time frame or at a different rate, the plant is obviously moving towards something. It's doing something. So the point is, movement becomes, this may be a good place to go when we're trying to understand, if it turns on somewhere, maybe it turns on with movement. Maybe there is such a thing as just passive movement. Maybe the most basic organisms didn't need to actually move. Maybe they're just bumping into food, because that's the reason why you would need to move, essentially, is because you need to restore your energy. You need to eat. But there's another theory out there which essentially says that some very basic organisms were just bumping into their food, or the food was just coming to them. So, and Peter Godfrey Smith, him and many others mentioned that life evolved in the ocean and water, and the water is such a turbulent place where you can imagine that some extremely basic life form would just be, by accident, more or less, be getting its energy, and it wouldn't really need to move towards anything. So maybe movement is essential. Maybe that's where an organism evolved to have these representations of its environment. And then if that's true, then does it have something to do with the rate of motion? Very difficult question. because of course we're just looking at a rate of motion from our perspective, and I don't have a good answer for that one. Okay, so I don't have so much time left, so I'm going to skip this video, but essentially the video is just showing how a plant is moving towards some direction over time, which is clearly what plants do. So it would just be not very long. I can just show the beginning of it. Yeah, okay. Okay, yeah, we can just watch at least the beginning. Okay, I think we'll call that the finale. Okay, but the point is, it clearly looks like it's doing something that more evolved life forms are doing, you know, as far as we can tell, because of the rate that our visual perception processes things. Okay, so back to animals and pain and pleasure. So I already essentially mentioned my conclusion about whether or not animals have the capacity to feel pain and pleasure, and why I think it's necessarily true that if you are an animal, if you're governed by valenced or evaluative representations, then it must be true that you can feel some at least very, very basic inputs of good and bad, right? And that's what I'm taking pain and pleasure to be. Now, that doesn't explain everything away. It could be that for a plant, an evaluation of bad or move away from this is one level above nirvana, right? It could still be really, really okay. And it could be nothing like what we're feeling when we're feeling like a pain from having a broken bone or pain from when we're suffering or something like this. So I don't think it doesn't lead to that. And it's important to point that out and to not make this seem like I'm saying that a plant is suffering in the same way that we're suffering. But if it's true that what suffering, what pain and pleasure are these evaluative judgments or experiences, then currently I see no good reason to draw the line. I mean, certainly fish, insects, plants, I'm not sure. You know, some people, and then there's a lot of people in neuroscience doing work around brains, and some people think that a brain is necessary. But really, we don't have a very, very good reason to think why a brain is necessary. One idea is that a brain is able to hold quantum states. There's a really well-renowned physicist, his name is Roger Penrose, and he's also interested in consciousness. And the way that he's thinking about consciousness is he's looking at these structures called microtubules, which are in all of our cells, but specifically in our nerve cells. And what's interesting about these structures is that it seems that anesthesia immediately affects, or it seems that anesthesia affects these structures. And why that's important is because that's the thing that turns off consciousness. So his idea with him and his colleague is that there's a direct relationship between consciousness and these microtubules. The function of these microtubules, he thinks, is that they're able to hold these quantum states that other structures in our body are not able to hold. But when I was watching him speak about this, he and his colleague essentially mentioned that plants also have their own way of doing this with I forget what it's called exactly, but it's holding some sort of quantum state. So anyways, it's not, so far, it may be that a brain is necessary, but so far that's not clear. But if it's true that a brain is necessary, then still we have, all the vertebrates. But my position at this time is that it's not clear that a brain is necessary. And the burden of proof is not on us, right? Because there's no good reason to think otherwise at this point, or that's what I claim. So just a quick recap, we talked about the fact that we're interested in experiences and not processes, like nociception, which is a process, which is a process of pain. And we talked about how animals are different from other organisms because they tend to their own self-interest through these evaluative representations, and therefore they're conscious by definition. And there's no line to draw with animals, between animals, but that there are degrees of consciousness in animals. And lastly, we concluded that pain and pleasure and their experiential equivalents are negative and positive evaluations. And just some final thoughts to leave you with is, to what extent does the degree of consciousness matter? That's a really big question. So if a plant is conscious, it's clearly not conscious to the degree that we are. To what extent does that matter? And do we attribute the same value to all conscious and self-interested animals or organisms? So just because, so let's say it's true that a plant does have its own interests, and therefore we shouldn't use it for our own means. Is it as simple as that? Is it as simple as saying that, well, this being has its own interests, so we value it and all other animals the same? So these are some really difficult questions that I just want to leave you with. And that's all. Thank you very much.